grieving living relatives, in this case, parents, is such a lonely group because it's something that people don't truly understand. And thankfully, there aren't a lot of people who go through it because you don't know, there's no support group, really. There's no, hey, like, I understand, I've lost a relative too. There aren't a lot of people who can understand it. And honestly, I think a lot of people who, like myself, go through it don't fully get it either.
Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And for me, that was in channeling my grief into good. Welcome to the show. In today's episode, I talk with Subrina Dhammi. She's a local journalist out of the Capital Region, and we talk about what she needs to do to prepare for some of the really hard stories she covers. She covers a lot of stories that involve deep grief. She covered the Boston Marathon bombing. She covered Hurricane Irene. She also covered Kalyn Gillis and was one of the few people granted interviews with her family after the terrible, terrible tragedy and the murder. We talk a lot in this episode, not only about the news she covers, but her own personal grief. Subrina is estranged from her parents, and she talks a lot about what that loss is like. The loss of grieving some people who are still living and how that impacts her life and her career as a journalist, but also her life as a mom, as a wife. We cover a lot of things, and I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Before we get into this week's episode, I wanted to tell you something new that I have tried that is going to help me manage my stress and hopefully my mental health. As you might have guessed, my to-do list is endless. Between the work with Jake's Help from Heaven and hosting A Place of Yes, I feel like I am never caught up. If you're anything like me, though, the first thing you do every morning is have coffee. It's not something I'm looking to give up, but it is something I know I need to balance. There's a constant joke among my friends that not only do I have brain fog, but I have undiagnosed ADHD. About a week ago, a friend of mine gently suggested that I do something about my issues. She suggested I try Magic Mind. Magic Mind is an energy shot that helps people stay focused with a calm, sustained energy. I can tell you I have been using it for 3 days straight, and I can feel the difference. So, if like me, you're looking to get away from caffeine, I would think you should try Magic Mind. These are filled with organic ingredients. One of the best ones is ashwagandha. It promotes calm, focus, supports stress management. And another thing about me that many of you may know is I'm always stressed. I'm always worried about the people in my life. So anything that takes the edge off, calms me down a little bit, makes me chill, is a win for everybody. If you want to try it, or you already are a fan of Magic Mind and want to buy some more, I hope you would consider buying it with my code, PlaceOfYes20. You get 20% off a one-time purchase, up to 48% off a subscription. You use the code at checkout, PlaceOfYes20. Go to magicmind.com/PlaceOfYes. We are sitting here today with Subrina Dhammi, and she is an anchor news reporter on WNYT News Channel 13 in Albany. In addition to being a journalist for 19 years, you're a mother, a wife, and a Syracuse University alum. Go Orange.
Yes, go Orange.
So welcome, Subrina. Thank you so much for being on A Place of Yes.
Thank you so much for having me.
We were introduced by someone who the audience knows, a previous guest, Shah Rabadi. I believe I had lunch with him after he had met with you. And he was like, you guys have to get together. Like a lot of people, I was like, I've seen her on the news. She seems awesome. Let's do it. But I didn't quite get it. And then when you and I talked, and then when I talked with him again, he really thought that the stories that I've been telling and the stories you have been telling for the last 19 years, there is kind of a connection.
Right.
Because we are sharing really kind of intimate stories, oftentimes of people's hardest, worst moments, whether it's personal grief or whether it's trauma. These are hard stories to tell.
They're so hard. And that initial meeting with Shaw after the sudden and tragic loss of his son, Philip, which became, very publicly known across the Capital Region, it took time for Shaw to, I think, trust me to share that story, to share Philip's story, and for him to know that I was going to do it in the way that would honor the memory of Philip and the way the family really wanted the story to be told. I'm so honored that they trusted me in the way to share Philip with me and so I could share with everyone else. But our conversation, which led to him putting me in touch with you, was just me kind of talking about how I am drawn to telling these stories. There's something that speaks to me when it's involving sharing stories about grief. I feel almost a sense of duty that I want to do it, like I'm meant to do it.
Grief is, you're often seeing people, like I said, in their hardest moments, right?
But then when we share these stories, like I know I feel better. I feel lighter, honestly, with all these conversations. Some people are like, oh, doesn't it feel heavy talking about this all the time? I don't think it does. I think it actually feels lighter. And to me, when I think of previous generations that did not have these conversations, I feel that had to be heavy, like to keep it all inside.
You were supposed to.
Yes.
Right?
You know, it was kind of this thing, like you didn't talk about it.
So those who are older of our generation grew up with that you kind of pull it together. This is life.
Put on the face, like, yep.
Move on, right? But we see the younger generation and we're trying to reprogram ourselves because they're already growing up that way.
Yes.
They've grown up where you have permission to fall apart. With people, you at work, if you're having a bad day because there's something big going on in your life, you can show it.
You can keep it. Yeah, you don't have to keep it all in. So let's talk a little bit about your work, about telling those stories, whether it is the horrific murder of Phil Rabati, but you covered like the Boston Marathon bombing. You covered Irene. These tragic things where there's death and just so much stuff. And how do you honor those stories? How do you tell those stories? And how do you take care of yourself in telling those stories?
With a lot of these stories, I think my goal is to make it as comfortable as possible for the person sharing, because regardless of what it is, speaking with a runner who was there at the finish line when the bombs went off, Hurricane Irene, and people remembering their homes being washed away, losing everything. Or, a tragic loss, a murder, or a death in some awful way. You're making them relive that trauma, right? The only way to tell their story is to go through it again. I think my goal is to make sure my approach is gentle, respectful, but also accomplishes what they've agreed to do it.
Yes.
So let's not dance around it so much. Let's make sure that you're happy with the end result. I do a ton of prep work, because I know I want to have all of the ins and outs of the person, from the fun, memorable stuff to the very tough topics that we have to get into. And then after the fact, you don't just like pack up and go, right? You spend a little time kind of debriefing, talking. Was that okay for you? Was there anything you didn't say that you want to say? Or was there something that you said that you're like, you know what, I really didn't want to say that? As I'm putting it together, I'm in touch with them. I'm on the phone or checking in saying, FYI, this is when your story is airing. Here's kind of the gist of what I have. At the end of the day, I want them, whoever it may be, to be pleased and
probably proud of it
happy.
Too, in the same way that you're proud of it,
happy
right?
That they did it, right?
So much of what you just said is kind of the thought process of what we're trying to do here at A Place of Yes. The stories we're talking about, whether they are parents who have lost children or other forms of grief, or sometimes we're talking very much with moms and dads whose kids are still alive and are not close to dying, but it's this grief of the life you thought you were going to have. It is these stories that are emotional and touching, and you want people to feel better after sharing it, right? Not, oh my God, what did I say?
As a journalist, that we're essentially storytellers, and whatever story you gravitate towards, whether it's politics or it's finance or corruption, right? We're storytellers. For me, what I gravitate towards is the human connection pieces, the pieces that will make our community feel more connected. Yeah. If we know more about the people here, maybe it inspires us to be more of a unit.
If we know what's going on in each other's lives, we can't help but be more compassionate, right? It's so easy to assume that we know what goes on, but we don't know what happens, right? Like, I learned this phrase from actually a podcast that I was on as a guest. Part of the work they had was like, the topics we talk about are very difficult. You might experience something, and I think they called it an emotional hangover. What a phrase.
Yes.
Like, yes, I know a hangover. However, there's a different kind. Every once in a while, there will be episodes we're recording where I'm like really close to the person, or it's just we go kind of deeper than usual, or it's a week where we record 3 or 4, and by the end of the week, I am like emotionally wiped. For the last 19 years where you have been making a living of this, it has got to be hard sometimes to separate. Like sometimes I feel the only thing I can do is like sit on my couch and like stare. How do you turn it off when you're home like with your husband and with your daughter?
Right. You have to let it out. I have a 9-year-old, so I don't want to, necessarily fall. I don't want to always talk about all of the stories that I'm working on with her, but I don't turn it off necessarily. I will say I had a tough day. Today was really hard for mommy. So I will be honest with her on that. And then I will, my husband, he's such a lovely man, and he will listen to me kind of unload. But otherwise, running is kind of my outlet, and just little things like that kind of are like my own little therapy.
Like safe space almost to just let
to
it out.
Clear my head.
Yep.
And I don't want to for one second pretend that has in any realm of what these people have gone through. I think it's just listening to it. It's just, of course, makes you sad.
Yes.
You absorb it.
This is kind of a weird question, but maybe not. I think you do, as we talked about, like you do such a great job of trying to honor and being very thoughtful. Are there times that no matter how thoughtful you are or how prepared or how much of yourself you put into it, that the story just comes out wrong? Or that even though you had the best intentions, the family or the individuals or whatever are still upset?
I will say that there have certainly been times where a family after the fact was like, I didn't think you were going to show that video, or I wish that hadn't been in there. So things like that where we revisit, and now we live in this day where it airs, but then it lives forever on the internet.
Yes.
So we try to, do our best, where we'll pull it off, remedy it, put it back on in the version that pleases them. I will say it's kind of the opposite of that, where sometimes we're in the middle of an emotional conversation and I pull back too much.
Okay.
And I will rewatch and say, I could have, there was an opportunity where maybe I could have revisited that or gone around that in another way. And so you have that kind of Monday morning quarterback thing where you're like, just because it started getting emotional, I think I got scared that I'm like, oh, I don't want them to, and I pull back, where it could have gone even further and therefore had been even more powerful.
But there's such a line with that, right? And I by no means am presuming to put myself in the same situation as you, but I know I'll be having these conversations sometimes, and it's hard for me, when I see that the conversation we're having, because I know, someone's talking about their person who's passed away, or they're going to pass away, or whatever the story is. I see that I'm getting there, and then it's that moment of okay, we can go further, and it potentially could be really therapeutic. It's going to be really good content,
right? But
But you don't want to feel like you're exploiting that moment.
Exactly.
And I feel like there's this line, right? And you never know. The line changes with every conversation.
100%. And you don't want to ever look like you're exploiting someone's grief.
Yes.
Just for the sake of telling a story, just for ratings or what people might think. That's never the end goal. I can say that with my full heart.
Yes. One of the things you touched on, and one of the things I definitely wanted to talk about with you, and you had brought it up both of the times we talked before, was this idea of we're real people. And you kind of alluded to it, about the station, you're as a team, as a network, you're trying to tell these stories, and you're doing it in a real way. We're all humans, right? But talk to me about that, because you're living a very a public life, and everyone wants to believe kind of the image of what is out there. You know what I mean? But there's so much more to it. To some degree, to be telling the stories as thoughtfully as you do, it's personal. Yes. I would imagine.
There's this perception, I think, that local TV news is that it's glamorous in some way. There's nothing glamorous about what we do. It's hard, long hours, that it's never a 9 to 5 and you're done and you go home and shut your computer off, turn your phone. Never. A lot of the stories that I tell, it's not an assignment that's given to me from my boss. They're stories that I go after because I see that this might be another avenue to explore.
Okay. That
we can talk about this family looks like they might want to talk, and I'll on a weekend be on the phone with them or meeting them on my own time.
Yep.
So yes, there's nothing that we're just sitting back and someone's handing us scripts and it's read the news and someone's doing our makeup and hair. No. We do our own makeup and hair, by the way.
Really? That's so funny, because I sort of assumed that you had a staff or a glam squad.
Right.
No glam squad.
Which would be, I'm sure, super fun, but we are, we're storytellers, and so we're down to the last second writing our script quickly. Throw some mascara,
not shiny.
Go. Yeah. Mark, my co-anchor, he's like, "You look a little shiny." I'm ripping a script and blotting my face. I mean, it's just down and
real.
dirty, and it's real, but it's authentic and genuine in that sense. And we are invested in this community.
Absolutely.
We are not passing through. We have our homes here. We have our families.
You're raising
here.
your families here. You're living your life here.
So we're dedicated to telling the stories here. Yeah.
It's kind of funny, the glam squad thing, right? Because I do think that people, as a society, we do this in general, right? Like we think because someone's in the public eye that we know them. We think, we do it with anybody. You're like, oh, we'd be best friends in real life. You kind of make up this thing. But
and that's what we want.
yes, you want that like.
Yes, and I love when people say, I feel like I know you, or I feel like I have coffee with you I want that. Because that's when I'm doing something
that
right.
you're connecting with them, that it's like you're having a chat. So how do you separate that, like the public persona from just like the real person going through whatever it is in your life, like your day to day? Like
I feel like I used to put more effort into that.
Okay.
When I was younger, where I wouldn't go to the store to grab like a few things without throwing some makeup on.
Okay.
I think I cared a lot more, but I think as we get older,
we seem to care less. I know.
And I entered my 40s. I think you settle into more of who you are. Your priorities change, and what matters changes. Where people will say to me, the number one thing I get. And I can say I have had maybe one or two negative interactions with people where they just didn't like
in public
in
or
public.
okay, yeah.
No, just passing in the store.
Okay.
They didn't like a story I tell, or they didn't really like the way I said something minor like that. But overall, everyone is always so nice and always so positive, where you can't help but be like, it's enjoyable to have those nice interactions. But the number one thing I get from people is, you look so much smaller in person. And I'm like, you mean like shorter?
You're like,
or skinnier?
Yeah, you're like
and they're like, just, smaller. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll take it.
Any of those versions, take it all in. Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
But to separate the two, I know for a long time, and we spoke about this after I had my daughter, for several years after that, I'm very active on my Facebook page with viewers, and their viewers are so, and I appreciate it, so active in return, where we have this constant nice dialogue going on my Facebook page. But a lot of people kept asking me, when are you having a second? When are you having your second child? It kept on coming. People in person would say, oh, your daughter is so beautiful. When are you having another one? And I started brushing it off like, oh, well, we'll see when the time is right. But it got to the point when she was about, I think, 7 years old, and people were still asking, where I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to put a blanket statement out there on my Facebook page that you don't have to share these things, but it's almost like, okay, well, I'm okay with sharing this with everyone, that we tried and we had fertility issues and we were not able to, and we chose to stop where we did and embrace what we have. And the responses were beautiful and lovely. And people are, thank you for sharing that. And of course, other people who have had the similar experiences or even worse were like, thank you so much for doing that, because you never know, like you said, what someone is going through, and the intentions are well-meaning. It's hurtful.
It can be. So and that's a little bit where when you live a somewhat public life in today's world, where there is, like you mentioned, Facebook, Instagram, and sometimes it just gets harder and harder to keep anything kind of personal or closer to the vest. I mean, I think that's a great example, right? Of like, you have this personal part. The drawback of people feeling like they have coffee with you every morning is that they feel like you owe them something, or that, you know what I mean? Like that there's this like two-way street. And we've talked about this, because I agree with you. I agree that most people, I won't say all, but the vast majority of people never mean to be hurtful.
Right.
But people might say things or ask questions and they don't know that they're kind of like picking at a scab. When that comes up, like, was it hard for you to like kind of address that? Like,
yes. Yeah, it was. Because once you make it public, you're becoming vulnerable.
Yes.
Right?
That's exactly it. It's like this vulnerability.
Right. I had to, I think, be okay with that. Yeah. And truly, I think I waited until I was ready, but until I was like, I have fully embraced what I have, and I'm happy with what I have. We have this beautiful little girl, and we're so incredibly blessed. And no matter
who's
what
to say, like, that
anyone
the perfect
says,
family has this or that,
more than
right?
One
like,
or two, yeah. So no matter what anyone said after that, which nobody said anything negative, but I was prepared. If anyone was going to say something, I didn't care. At that point, But everyone was so lovely about it, and it stopped.
One of the things people would always say after Jake died was, are you going to have another kid? It was such a stab, like it just felt like a punch in the gut, really, because I was like, no. And it took me a long time to have the appropriate words to answer that, because it just, people would ask that question, and I think they were trying, like they were in their own minds being like, well, how can we help? Well, maybe it'll be a distraction for her. It's something she needs. It's whatever. But all I heard was like, oh, you're going to have a replacement child. Right. I do think facing it, like being vulnerable, I think all of that, and certainly like when Jake passed, I was still in my 30s. stories. I was pretty young. Like I still had a young child. I'm a big believer now in kind of like embracing that vulnerability, right? And putting it out there. People respond and they're like, keep doing that. It's so helpful because there's the people who are like, I'm feeling that exact same way. Or I have been through that. And when we face it, it helps us personally too, right? Like
it's this like beautiful cycle, right? In order to, we've talked about getting people to feel comfortable talking with you, but you have to kind of be a real person too and show that side of you so that that also helps them feel
because if they think you're this like perfect image, no one's telling you anything. Are there other things? So we talked about, your infertility journey. And sharing that publicly. Are there other pieces you think in your own personal story that impact how you are as a journalist?
For sure. Obviously, we all take away the way we've grown up into, builds who we are, it shapes who we are. But as a journalist, I think one of the reasons why I am drawn to these human connection stories where grief is involved is because of just some of the things I've gone through as a child. I mean, I grew up in a broken home. I'm estranged from both of my parents. It's a messy situation. There was abuse, there's psychological, physical abuse growing up, and I think caused me to struggle at times with the connection piece. And so I think doing it now as a journalist, through a career, has given me an avenue where I can feel that.
Yeah.
Where I didn't really feel it as much when I was younger. I didn't have this home that was filled with love, and I didn't feel love until I met my husband. And then when I had my daughter, I was like blown away, where I'm like, whoa, what is this feeling? I'm overwhelmed
like,
by
I don't
this.
Understand.
This is like somebody get me a therapist to help. But it was a piece I think that was really missing within me. It entered my life at such a late stage. So telling these stories, I think, helps me to feel personally to feel connected with someone as well.
Do you think the reason that you gravitate towards the stories you gravitate, though, is because you, like, even growing up, like, even if you weren't experiencing what you are doing for your family, right? Like, I mean, I can just tell the way you talk about your daughter. Like, you are trying so hard to give her what you did not have.
But I overcompensate a little.
That's what we all do, right? Like, we take the things from our childhood, then we go like all in the other direction, and then our children will like go all, and they will overcorrect in a separate way. Those moments, right? Like the things we feel like when we're children, and you're talking about, being estranged from both of your parents. And I talk with a lot of our guests about grief, and we talk about grief as the traditional grief, someone someone you love has passed. But what I have learned in so many of these conversations are so many other forms of grief exist. There's this like ambiguous grief where the person can still be alive, but you're still grieving them. There's like anticipatory grief. I imagine that you have been in a lot of these different kinds of grief because it's human nature, right? That you have parents or guardians or figures in your life that are supposed to be there. Right. And when they're not, you have to figure that out. And I suspect to some degree you have had to grieve that relationship.
Living parents, right?
Yes.
Spot on. I remember feeling, very alone, very confused as a child. And so when I see anything like an emotional moment in my daughter, right away, I'm like, let's talk about it. I never want her to feel like she's in a space where it's not safe to share how she's feeling, that no matter what, I'm going to be there to catch her if she's falling. I never want her to feel that, because that is how I felt growing up. These different forms of grief, and grieving living relatives, in this case, parents, is such a lonely group, because it's something that people don't truly understand. And thankfully, there aren't a lot of people who go through it, because you don't know. There's no support group, really. There's no, hey, like, I understand, I've lost a relative too. There aren't a lot of people who can understand it. And honestly, I think a lot of people who, like myself, going through it don't fully get it either. Why do you not have a relationship with your mother? It's like, where do I begin?
Yes.
I can say it's healthier for me this way.
To not.
However, you still grieve what you could have had.
Well, and you grieve what you see other people have.
Exactly.
But could you talk about that? Like, what was your childhood like? Like, what made it so, like, what made you feel so alone? And I know you have a brother.
Yes.
How close are you in age?
We were just a year and a half apart.
So was that your family? Like, were you in this together, did you feel? Or did you feel like you were his protector? Or like, what was the dynamic?
Yes, I felt like I was his protector.
Okay.
I felt like I had to shield him almost. I mean, you have like little glimpses that, that pop up in your head from your childhood, like both of us sitting on the stairs, listening, to our parents downstairs,
Arguing,
and, he's crying and I'm like, has my arm around his shoulder, like it's okay.
And how old are you in that, like, kind of?
We were probably like 5, 6 years old.
So
at this
young.
moment. We were little, yeah.
Like this is like, these are your core memories.
Yes, these little glimpses.
Yes.
My family was born and raised in India. They relocated here in the 80s, so I'm the first generation to be born in America. So I grew up in a very Indian household that, we had an altar in the house. We would, we would go to temple every weekend. We were very much, culture was a big part of our house. But my parents had a very rocky marriage, and my father left when I was very young. We went through, nasty custody battles in and out of court. And, I remember at one point we had to write a letter to the judge when I was a teenager about who we wanted to live with.
God. Yeah,
but my mother really wanted me to become like some kind of big Bollywood actress, and that, we would go back to India and I would be this great dancer. And I did grow up dancing and I became quite good at it, but the pressure of being the best, and she put me in beauty pageants, and
that wasn't the generation either that asked if you wanted to do any of that, right? That was just what you did.
You're doing it,
yes.
Right? You're doing it, and if I didn't do well, then I would have to pay the price on the other end. But I can say now, at 41 years old, looking back, I know she did the best that she could, given the state she was in and the cards that she was dealt. That doesn't erase or change what we went through. But I mean, there were times where she raised her hand at us. I just physically never felt like I looked good enough, or I danced well enough, or I did well enough in school. It was constantly that beat down of your confidence and your self-esteem.
At a time when, when we're young, we're reliant sort of on the people around us to help us, like to be safe and to explore who we are. And then as a teenager, let's be real, being a teenager sucks under the best of circumstances, looking back, or at least I think it did. Like, you're awkward, everything, I mean, it is what it is. But when you're not being embraced and loved and encouraged for who you are, it's harder.
And told that you're beautiful.
That you're valuable.
Yes, and you're, and it's so nice. Like, people will say, "Oh, Subrina, you look so pretty on TV." I grew up, I didn't hear that in my house. And so it was something that I still look in the mirror and I'm like, because my vision of myself,
it's still wrapped up in that, right? So you say that you're estranged from both of them. Is that 100% you're doing?
So my father, it's been a very long time. And it's last time I saw him was probably 20 plus years ago. So we've kind of, I think, put that to rest. And
do you think he watches you on TV?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't believe he doesn't live in the area.
Okay.
So it would only have to be, streaming or something online. But I haven't heard anything from him. Not a single word. My mother, it's within the past decade, and that was more her doing. And it was after I had my daughter, so that was that kind of crazy time where you kind of do need all of the people.
Yes.
So my brother has a new baby, 9-10 months old now, and they just moved up here specifically for that reason. They were living in Texas, and they relocated here because he was just kind of like doing his thing, traveling, living wherever. And then they had their son. He got married and had their son. And he's like, wow, we need to be close to each other. Like we
need, so create your own family.
Yes. And let's have our kids, my daughter and his son, grow up together with that security. My brother and I both took away very different things from our childhood because we all react to trauma differently. Yeah. It seeps into our lives in different ways. And so we have kind of grown apart and come back together as we navigate our own individual grief. And
was his experience different because he was a boy?
Yes. Okay. And in Indian culture, boys are revered.
Yeah, that's right. So I was wondering if
there wasn't a lot of pressure on him as much, and he was always, I think everything was more gentle. But therefore, there was neglect because there was so much focus on, let's see if Subrina can make something of herself.
It's wild, especially now being a parent, right?
Yeah.
Like, because in the beginning, there's just everything that you don't want to do. even under the best of circumstances, right? You're just kind of like, oh. But then under the worst of circumstances, I feel like is the pressure even more? Like, do you carry that with your daughter? Do you feel like that you're over, like, you know, we kind of joke about it because I joke all the time. I'm like, oh, I totally overcome. Like, are there things that you feel like you have to like check yourself a little bit?
Every day, every day. And I try to be honest with her, like we talked about, where if I feel like I kind of messed that up. So at the end of the day, I'll apologize. Yeah. I try to apologize to her, say, I'm sorry. I probably could have said that differently, or I was probably a little overbearing or tried to do too much to protect you there. Now she's 9. She's very aware of her family situation, and she asks questions. And, you know,
does she ask about your parents?
She does, you know, and I try to explain to her at the level that, you know, age appropriate, that, you know, not all families look the same, but the most important thing is whatever the family we do have, that we love each other and we will always be there for each other no matter what. I never want her to feel like because this happened around, you know, surrounding her, that somehow this is going to happen to her too, you know?
Do you think she watches you? Do you think she follows you at all? Is she local?
She's not local. Okay. She, I believe, last I know, has moved to India, but does see on Facebook from time to time things I will post. But she hasn't seen my daughter since she was a baby, since she was a newborn.
Does that probably in a weird way almost hurts more than towards you, right? I mean,
yeah, because, and you brought up like you see other families, right? So little things like seeing grandparents pick their kids up from school. You know, when you're picking up and we're trying to like manage between the two of us. We just have the one, but between the two, we both work full time. But now you're both
working, and
you know, who's going to go there? And then you see, you know, Pop is picking up that family's kids today, and you're like, you just can't help but feel a little
like, oh, why don't I have that?
Pangs of envy, and that's the stuff that we grieve. Yeah,
I'm sorry about that though. That is hard, right? Like it's hard. Yeah. We all carry stuff with us. Some of them are just heavy. Yeah. And no matter how much you think or you want or you try to like process and be okay with it, sometimes it's still heavy.
It is. And thank you for saying that. And I know when we initially chatted prior to us doing this, you had asked, and have I ever talked about this? And I've never really shared this publicly in my 19 years, my personal family situation, because, you know, some things you just want to protect about yourself until you fully feel like comfortable sharing it. And I'm not, you know, in any way ashamed of what I come from. I think you just protect little pieces of yourself as you process it, you know, that as you're trying to figure it out on your own. But, you know, this is where I have arrived, and it has shaped who I am. It affects my career in the way that I therefore manifested into let's create human connection.
Yes.
Let's tell stories that matter.
You know, you touched on something too, is I think as we age, as we become more comfortable with who we are, we see that some of those imperfections is not the word, but like the dents are the things that make us unique and make us, right? You know what I mean? Like it's not the perfect childhood that makes you, you know what I mean? It's all those things that are part of our story.
Right.
But once you embrace all of the chapters, I think it's kind of, it's freeing.
It is. It's less on your mind, less on you. I mentioned to you that, you know, through this storytelling, it does affect me, but I never want it to not. Yeah. As a journalist, as a human being, where you can hear, you know, tough moments that people are going through or have gone through, or if they're, you know, getting emotional right in front of you. And if you don't feel anything in that moment, that's when I'm like, okay, it's time to either move on to another career or maybe take a good self-reflective moment. Yeah.
And I think this is a sort of a bigger statement, but like as a society, sometimes I think we have become numb, right? You know, there's always the stories of like, I mean, I remember Columbine when I was living in Boston and I was young, like I had just finished college or I was still in college. That was like this crazy thing that the entire nation was like weeping over. Right. And now we're at this point where, you know, there's always these statistics, how many school shootings, how many mass shootings, how many, you know what I mean? Like, and it's hard for me sometimes to remember the different levels of it, right? Like the one that everyone was just, how did this happen? And now where it barely is newsworthy because it's happening all the time. And that's that feeling, right? Like where we as a society sometimes become numb, and we need to make sure that as individuals we don't. It's just too much sometimes, but you have to feel it.
We're challenged as journalists too, to not keep telling that story in that way, you know. Today, here's the new statistic that
blah, 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 blah.
And I think that's a challenge that we face, that we'll continue to share important things that need to be told, but in a way that maybe people will
compelling or look at it a little bit different. You know, so you had mentioned earlier, kind of come back full circle to the storytelling and your career, that, there's not a boss being like, okay, Subrina, on Monday you're doing this, on Tuesday you're doing this. How do you find your stories?
It's kind of odd. Like it'll be something random. So specifically with these kinds of interviews, most recently that awful story with Kalyn Gillis.
Yes.
And her friends, they were turning around in the driveway in Washington County when they were shot at and she was tragically killed. Her family, her parents were so kind, and throughout the whole court proceeding would make it a point to say hello and thank you for the coverage. I knew at some point that they would want to share her story.
Yeah.
But that was not the time.
Yes.
So after everything was said and done, and Kevin Monahan, the man who fired the shots, was convicted, and we let some time go by, I reached out. So it's kind
so you have kind of almost like in the back of your head, or like you have a list of like not list, but like a thought of like, this is a story to tell.
There's a story to tell,
and they want to tell it.
And they want to tell it. You just have to wait for the right time. And if they want to tell it, then pursue it then. And so, but as soon as they were like, okay, yeah, we're ready, they've relocated to Florida since everything happened. That's where Kalyn always wanted to live.
Okay.
And so to honor her, they moved there. But I, messaged back and forth, corresponded back and forth with Kalyn's father, Andy, and he's like, okay, let's do it. And I'm like, okay, well, it was a Thursday. And so I went to my boss and I was like, we can fly down this weekend. If you let's go.
Let's do
and
it.
He's like, okay, fine, like do it. And so that's the kind of stuff that whatever I had going on that weekend, like
next week.
Next week, pushed it aside because I'm like, this right away matters so much to me that he's like, yeah, I'm like, oh my God, like you're willing to open up to me like that. I am, of course, going to put everything aside and, let's go and do it. And they were so wonderful and lovely and candid and open. But again, I feel like those are stories that matter and that
they
should
do
be told.
matter.
And one thing that I said to Kalyn's parents when they were like, well, I don't know, if we want to do this, I'm like, just because the headlines are done, you're still living with this and you will continue to live with this. And that's why, I don't personally care how much time goes by, because if families want to talk 2-3 years later about something tragic that has happened that we covered, of course.
Then we want,
of course.
And I think that's important, because I do think that lesson too is also like, we sometimes think that things are only newsworthy for the moment they're newsworthy, because there's always going to be a tragedy and there's always going to be something else. But the stories that we're telling and the families and the news things that you're covering, there's life beyond them, right? Like, I mean, even when Jake died, there was like, Jake died for, the obituary, for the services, for everything. It's over. But the life continues, right? Like our lives continued. What we did with that, like all of the story continues. We have now reached the portion of the show where we call it Ask Heather Anything.
All right. I'll do two questions if that's okay.
Absolutely.
We'll do a lighter one and maybe a little more of a serious one. So
it's kind of dangerous asking a journalist to ask me anything.
I know.
It's kind of bold on my part.
No.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go crazy here. I do wonder, as you talk about Jake and all of the work you do kind of in his memory, do you find yourself talking to him?
I talk to him all the time. Twofold. I talk to him sometimes out of desperation, because I'm so nervous of the day that what if I don't think of him, or what if I don't talk about him because so much time has passed. So sometimes it's like desperate, but most of the time, the majority of the time, it's just like, hey, buddy, you're not going to believe what happened today. And we joke in my house a little bit that it's not uncommon to hear me talking out loud with no one else in the room. So I'm either talking to myself, and my husband will be like, are you talking to me, or are you having a staff meeting? And I'm like, oh, I'm having a staff meeting. You're not invited. Or I'm talking to Jake. Sometimes I'll tell him a very specific, like Jake's Help from Heaven story, because there'll be like equipment that we'll buy someone that didn't exist when he was around. And I'm like, oh, you would have loved the chill out chair. Sometimes I vent to him because I'm like, I don't know who else to like just bitch at. So like sometimes I just do that. And like I talk, like Ethan and I have a really close relationship, and I sometimes want to emulate that with Jake. So I'll just tell him some things about Ethan or something.
That's beautiful. That desperate piece, though, that you were talking about, is it a fear of just
forgetting? It's a fear of forgetting, and it's a fear of having moved on, and yes, he's been gone almost 14 years. I have lived more of my life, with him gone than with him. Like, as his mom, I'm like, if I'm not thinking of him all the time, then other people are not either. And that makes me really sad. Like, I just, that love we have for our kids, right? And it's so deep, and it never went away just because he passed away. I just have this like fear of, if he's not in the forefront of my mind, then other people will forget.
Oh, all right. So to lighten things up a little bit, you had mentioned the emotional hangover and how we've all been hungover. So all right. So what's your craziest hangover story?
Oh, God. I would say one of my most recent hangovers, last September, a group of old friends, like my husband's best friend from kindergarten, friend from high school, his wife. We have been friends for 20 years. We went to Oktoberfest in Germany.
Ooh.
Yeah, we went to Munich. I was in a dirndl. The boys were in lederhosen. Like, we went. I would say top 5 experiences of my life. But I will say that you don't just get a beer there, you get a liter of beer. And you do that multiple times throughout the day. Like, I did not know I was capable of drinking as much beer as I did. I don't get hungover like I used to because I kind of know when to stop.
Mm-hmm.
I do have like boundaries. One night, like we went, we ended up in a nightclub. Like we did Munich. And I will say that next day, I was dead. We all were. We were like zombies. And it turns out if you just go back to the tents and have another liter of beer, you feel better. But
you bite the bear that bit you.
There you go. But I will say that I remember laying there, both Brian and I, and it was kind of like when you do that, like one eye open and you're like, oh, like my brain, I felt like my brain was scraping my skull.
Yes.
Like I was like, could not get enough water.
This is how it is.
Yeah, this is it. And here I am in Munich. Thank you, Subrina, so much for being a guest on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
For those of you listening, don't forget about Magic Mind. There is a link in the description. Don't forget to use the code PlaceOfYes20 at the website magicmind.com/PlaceOfYes. Place of Yes 20. No A, just Place of Yes 20. Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend, anybody who might benefit from listening to this. It would make a world of difference if we could just reach more people and share the work that we do and the stories we want to tell. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two.